Hello, and welcome to part 2. At this point, you've learned all about bumblebees, a bit about their biology, and the species that we have here in Indiana. For the second half of this training, we learn how to do photo surveys, how to take good pictures of bumblebees, and then how to upload your photos for analysis. So we will only be sampling bees through photography for the survey. This means that no bees will be killed, and handling of any bees is not required, though you may photograph bees after catching them in a net or a jar, if you'd like. There are a few requirements for when and where you can survey. Most importantly, please only survey on land where you have legal access, of course. The sites you visit can be in any type of natural area, but there must be actively blooming flowers for bees to feed on. Otherwise, how are you going to see any bumblebees? The months that we're targeting for the survey are May through August, so anytime. Generally, the only things that there really are to avoid are inclement weather, anything that would encourage bees from flying. So a lot of rain, a little bit is fine actually. High winds and temperatures below 60 degrees would all be reasons to postpone your field day. And these are the general survey steps. First, you will arrive at your chosen site, whatever that might be. We will have you fill out a habitat assessment form and a data sheet. We'll go over that next. We are going to get the latitude, longitude points of your site, so where exactly it is, and take a picture of that data sheet for future data submission. And then you'll move between floral patches and try and photograph every bumblebee that you see. And overall, we'd like you to spend about 1 person-hour per 3 acres of land. This is just to get an approximation for how much surveying effort that you do, but this is not a strict requirement. If you can only spend 15 minutes, of course, you do what you can. And that's it. Now I will go over those habitat assessment forms and data sheets that I was talking about. I want to emphasize that this habitat form here, this first one, this is the least important. If you find it confusing or have questions, please reach out. But also know that an incomplete form is better than no form, and that the photos that you take and then the data sheet are the most important thing here. Please just do your best. So this is the first form, our habitat assessment form. We're asking you to fill this out if you can. This is so we can get important information on the types of habitat that we see our bumblebees in to better inform conservation decisions. So on this page, fill out the date, your name here, and then the site name. This site name can be anything as long as it's unique. Then circle one of these here, the percent natural habitat that's within a 5-kilometer radius of your site. This is easiest figured out by opening Google Maps or another map program and just see how much of that is natural area. When surveying, unless you're in a garden surrounded entirely by developed land, you'll likely have more than 30%. These would be your protected lands, your nature preserve, your forest, etc. And then choose one dominant vegetation type. Unless you know otherwise, most of Indiana is going to be a mix of native and naturalized plants. So these are the features for just your site. So those are about the 3 acres you're surveying. That's about 2 football fields together. How much of that is natural habitat? This includes grasses, anything that's not buildings or pavement, essentially. So this should be pretty high if you're in an area that has bumblebees. And then for the rest of the section, mark off any of these features here: permanent meadows, hay to land, wooded or wetland, and a vegetative buffer within a water feature. Mark this off if you know it's present. Of course, it's always okay to mark uncertain or NA if you're not sure. Typically, this is information you'll have if you're involved in the management of this property in some kind of way. Next, section 3, this is about the foraging habitat that you see at your site. Make the best estimates that you have for the number of native species that you have for spring, summer, and fall. Of course, you won't be at the site for all seasons, but just make your best estimate, and the same goes for this below segment as well. For all these species here, how many of these approximately do you see present where you're surveying? And then overall, a total overall estimation for how much of that cover is foraging habitat, what's available for bees to feed on. Basically, what's flowering or will be flowering. And then the last part of this form, take note of how much area you see that could be suitable nesting habitat. So this will be areas with undisturbed native bunch grasses. These are very tall clumping grasses that are very difficult to walk through, and areas with loose soil with ideally evidence of rodent activity. So disturbed soil, holes, surface tunnel, mark out about as much of this as you can see. Part C, how much of your site is not controlled in any way, how much of it is left to grow to its own devices. And then for D, how much woody cover is left on the site. This will be your wood piles or mulch piles. How much leaf litter is left on the site? Is it left on the site? And then lastly, are there managed commercial bumblebees or honeybees on the site? This is usually pretty obvious. Either you see those bee boxes or you don't. And for bumblebees, this will usually only be a yes if you're in or next to a large tomato field where those common eastern bumblebees are kept. So that is it for the habitat assessment form. Please do your best with this. We understand that it can be complicated sometimes, but as much information as you can give us about the habitat features of your sites will be extremely useful for data analysis down the line. But next, getting to that data sheet, this is the most important thing here. This is where you'll fill out the most crucial information that we need to look at the data from your survey. So first of all, please put your name, your email address, and that same site name from before. Then fill in the date that you're doing your survey, day, month, year is already filled out. That project name is filled out for you here. And then use your weather source of choice to fill in temperature and wind speed. This can be as simple as looking at what other weather app on your phone should have this, and then estimate cloud cover to the best of your ability. This in which fully clear is 0%, overcast is 100%, anything else will be in the middle. And now we ignore this next part about the transect length and width. We've already got that X'd out for you. Instead, we need to fill out the total amount of time to start and end time that you've spent surveying. This is just an important measure with the amount of effort that you're expending on each survey. Just give us an approximation here. And then estimate your total survey area. We'd like to shoot for about 3 acres, the closest estimation that you can get for where you'll be surveying. And then here's arguably the most important thing, that's centroid. That's just one point approximately central for where your survey is. So we can plot that on a map. You can find this either using a GPS device or just with Google Maps or Apple Maps. If you look at your location, it should give you the coordinates that way. If you have your survey area boundaries, you can provide that, but this part's not required. And so this is the bottom part of that data sheet. Next, we'd like you to just pick one habitat type, whatever matches. It's probably going to be some type of mixed forest, shrublands, or grassland. Again, estimate the amount of vegetative cover, just generally where you are, generally the number of native plant species, and then if you have this information, you may not, the description of the management practices and any stressors that could be present in your area. This would be pesticides, tilling, anything you might observe. And then the very last thing here, when we upload these to Google Drive, we'll have you put these in a folder that you will give us the name of. So write that right here so we know which data sheet will be assigned to what folder. And then this whole page here in the front, you'll be taking a photo of this in the field and submitting that with your photos. That's all. So this very last section of the talk, we'll be talking about how to best photograph bumblebees for this survey. When taking pictures of bumblebees, there are a few key features that will be really important for identification. There are 3 main segments on the bumblebee. Starting from the top, we have the head, the thorax, and then the abdomen. On the head, the colors of the vertex, which is the crown of the head, and the colors of the hair on the face are both important ID features. On the thorax, it's very useful to see how much and in what shape those black hairs are in. Next, bumblebee abdomen is split up into distinct segments, and those segments can be yellow, black, red, or a combination of these colors. The abdominal color pattern is one of the most important features that we use to identify bumblebees. And lastly, there are a few other extra features that are useful for ID. First, bumblebees that collect pollen have a structure called the corbicula on the outer edge of their hind leg. I mentioned this a bit in the first video. Parasitic bumblebees don't have a corbicula because they aren't bringing any pollen back to their nests, so the presence or absence of this feature can be a clue to some IDs. And occasionally, bumblebee species can be relatively larger or smaller, so sometimes we can use relative size as an ID tool as well. So going into some examples, here's an example of different colored vertex hairs. This bee on the left here is Bombus pennsylvanicus, that is the American bumblebee, and you can see that crown of the head is entirely black. However, Bombus auricomys, the black and yellow bumblebee, which looks very similar to Bombus pennsylvanicus in most other ways, this has a yellow vertex. It looks a bit like a widow's peak. Here are some examples of different color patterns on the thorax. Some bees, like Bombus bimaculatus, all the way here on the left, only has a small patch of black in the center of that thorax. Some bees, like Bombus fervidus, have a very clear black band through the center. And some bees, like Bombus pennsylvanicus, have this band, this interalar band, but they have more black down at the bottom. So this can be a very useful ID feature here. This is a nice angle photo to send in. So when you're taking pictures of bumblebees in the field, this right here, either of these, honestly, would be the perfect photo that you could potentially send in. As you can see, several of these key characteristics are clearly visible. We can see the face and the vertex color. They're all black. That thorax has the black interalar band, as well as a bit more black down the back. The abdomen has one black segment, and then next, another bee that looks quite a bit like the bumblebee is the carpenter bee, which you are probably already familiar with. It's extremely common to mistake these guys for bumblebees because of their similar yellow and black colors. But there are a few ways to tell them apart. The most reliable way is the texture of the abdomen, where in carpenter bees, it's almost always free from hairs and usually kind of shiny and metallic looking, whereas in bumblebees, this is almost always fluffy, like this. And another way to tell the difference is that male carpenter bees, which are usually the more aggressive ones that you'll notice, they have this distinct yellow paneling on the face. Bumblebees will never have this. And finally, it's not just other bees that do a good job mimicking bumblebees, but also several species of flies. This bee fly here on the left, hence the name, mimics bumblebees very well with its fluffy hair all over the body. It actually mimics bumblebees because it's a parasitoid, which means it lays its eggs in the larvae of bees or wasps. Kind of gross. Hoverflies, like this one here on the right, they can also be great bee mimics, especially certain species of robber flies, like this one in the middle. It's a very common species that we can find in Indiana. You can find all of these flies here in Indiana, actually, so keep an eye out. The best way generally to tell that it's fly and not a bee is to look at its face. Flies have very short antennae compared to bumblebees, and their eyes are usually large. Think of that typical bug-eyed fly. Flies, of course, are not going to be collecting and storing pollen like bumblebees do, though they can be effective pollinators. They're not going to be gathering pollen into a corbicula like bumblebees will. So definitely keep an eye out on those lookalikes. So once you're confident that you know that you have a bumblebee, here are some tips for how you can take those good photos. First of all, make sure you take a picture of your data sheet first before anything else, so we know when and where those pictures were taken. You don't need to get the entire sheet in the frame, but the date and the site and the name of the surveyor are most important, so we know how to associate that data sheet with your images. It can be easier to image bumblebees while they're on flowers, since they often hold still for a minute to gather nectar and pollen. If possible, we'd like for you to get a picture of that flower as well, since that can be useful data for us. And definitely try and take multiple angles of that bee if you can. That'll make sure you get enough useful ID features in your photos so that we can identify the bumblebee to species. And then lastly, we'd like you to take a spacer image between individuals, and this could be any neutral picture. Usually the sky or the ground works best. So you will take a picture of an individual bee and take a picture of the ground before you move on to the next bee. This just makes sure that we know when you're switching individuals, because sometimes these can look the same.